On July 2, 1874, Black Americans across the South and the border states walked to their bank branches and found the doors locked. There were 34 of those branches: Washington, Baltimore, Richmond, Norfolk, Charleston, Savannah, Augusta, Jacksonville, Mobile, New Orleans, Memphis, Nashville, Vicksburg, Little Rock, Louisville, St. Louis, Philadelphia, New York. The people standing outside them were washerwomen, farmhands, draymen, Union veterans, ministers, barbers, cooks, midwives, and a great many people who had been the legal property of other human beings 9 years earlier. Some of them had walked several miles to get there. A few of them had come every week for years to add $1. The amount of money on deposit in the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company on the day it closed was $2,993,790.68. It was owed to 61,144 depositors. Almost every one of them believed the United States government had guaranteed it. The bank had been chartered by an act of Congress. It had been signed into existence by Abraham Lincoln. Its headquarters was a marble building on Lafayette Square, a 2-minute walk from the White House and directly across the street from the Treasury Department of the United States. Its officers were introduced by Freedmen's Bureau agents. Its circulars were handed out at bureau offices. Everything about the institution communicated a single message, and the message was, "This money is safe because the government of the United States says it is safe." And there is one more reason they trusted it, and it is the most damning detail in the founding of the whole enterprise. The Freedmen's Bureau endorsed it. The commissioner of the Bureau, the federal official responsible for the welfare of 4 million freed people, publicly encouraged African Americans to deposit their money in the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company. Bureau agents in the field repeated the recommendation. To a freedman standing in a bureau office in Georgia in 1868, being told by the United States government's own representative to put his money in a bank the United States government had chartered in a building across from the United States Treasury, the distinction between a federal agency and a federally chartered private corporation was not merely obscure. It was invisible, and it was invisible because everyone with authority in the room was behaving as though it did not exist. The government had never said that. The deposits were not insured. There was no such thing as federal deposit insurance in 1874, and there would not be for another 60 years. And the men who had been investing that money for the previous 9 years had put a great deal of it into railroad bonds and Washington real estate. Start with the building, because the building is the thing everyone saw. It cost $260,000. In the currency of 1874, that is not a large sum for a bank headquarters. It is an astonishing one. You could put up a substantial county courthouse for a fraction of it. It stood on the southeast corner of Lafayette Square, in the most expensive few acres of real estate in the capital city, facing the Treasury. It was marble. It had the columns and the cornices and the whole architectural vocabulary that American money used to describe itself in the 19th century, and it was built with the deposits of people who had been sold at auction within living memory. Frederick Douglass wrote about the first time he laid eyes on it. He had read about the bank years earlier when he was living up in Rochester and had actually been solicited to become one of its trustees and had declined. Then he came to Washington and stood on Lafayette Square and looked at it. "The whole thing was beautiful," he wrote. "Remember that building. We will come back to it, and it is still standing." March 3, 1865. The war had 6 weeks left in it. On that single day, the Congress of the United States did 2 separate things. It established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, the Freedmen's Bureau, the first federal social services agency in the history of the country, tasked with rations, schools, labor contracts, and land for 4 million people who had just been released from bondage into a wrecked economy, and it chartered the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, 2 institutions, same day, Same Congress, same stated purpose of assisting the freedmen. And here is the thing that would matter more than anything else in this story. They were not the same organization. The Bureau was a federal agency. The bank was a private corporation that Congress had chartered. The government ran one of them and merely permitted the other. Nobody explained that distinction to the depositors, and there is very little evidence anyone tried. The idea for the bank had come out of a practical problem, and the problem was that black people had started to have money. By late 1861, in the border states and behind Union lines, large numbers of black Americans were experiencing something like freedom in the presence of occupying federal troops. Some found work in Union garrisons, some enlisted, and for the first time in their lives they were being paid in cash for their labor. A man who had never legally owned the shirt on his back suddenly had wages in his pocket and nowhere on earth to put them. So small banks were improvised across the occupied South to take deposits from black soldiers and from the men and women working in the garrisons. They held real money belonging to real people. Many of the records of those deposits were subsequently lost, and many of those freedmen were prevented from ever recovering what they had put in. Hold on to that because it happened first, in miniature, before the Freedmen's Bank existed at all. The pattern was established early. Black people deposited, records vanished, money did not come back. Northern abolitionists looked at the situation and reached a conclusion that was, for its time, radical in its optimism. What the freedmen needed was not charity, it was a savings institution, a real bank, with interest and passbooks and branches that would let a formerly enslaved family accumulate capital the way white families did, and thereby build the material foundation that freedom on paper had not provided. Douglass described the purpose in his own words. The bank existed, he said, to instill into the minds of the former slaves lessons of sobriety, wisdom, and economy, and to show them how to rise in the world. And the charter Congress wrote was, at the beginning, almost fanatically safe. The Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company was required to keep 2/3 of all deposits in United States government securities, not stocks, not real estate, not commercial loans, not paper of any kind issued by any private company, treasury bonds, the single safest financial instrument that existed in the world at that moment, backed by the credit of the government that had just won the Civil War. The remaining third was to be held as an available cash reserve. On paper, in 1865, the Freedmen's Savings Bank was close to unlosable. That was the entire design. The men who wrote the charter understood exactly who the depositors were going to be and how little margin those people had for risk, and they built a vault. The trustees were white. They were Northern. They were philanthropic. They were well-connected, and in that founding generation, most of them appear to have been sincere. The bank's first president was John W. Alvord, a Congregationalist minister who had served as the Freedmen's Bureau superintendent of schools, a man whose entire professional life had been spent on the education of freed people. Alvord himself is a strange figure to sit at the center of this. He was not a financier, he was a minister who had spent the war and the years after it building schools for freed children, the man who counted the schoolhouses and wrote the reports on how many black Americans were learning to read. He had no obvious business being the president of a bank holding $3 million, which was, in a sense, precisely the point. The institution had been designed as a moral project run by moral men, and moral men are not necessarily good at noticing when the finance committee is quietly moving $500,000 into the account of the chairman's brother. And the freedmen came. They came because it worked, and it is worth being precise about why it worked. A washerwoman in Richmond could walk in with $1, hand it across a counter, receive a passbook with her name and a number written in it, and come back a month later and find that the $1 was still there and had quietly become slightly more than $1. That was not a small thing. That was the first demonstration, for an enormous number of people, that the promise of emancipation had any material content whatsoever. Union veterans deposited their pay in their bounties. Church congregations opened accounts. Mutual aid and burial societies opened accounts. Fraternal lodges opened accounts. Farmhands deposited a share of the crop money. 34 branches were eventually operating across the country, and the total on deposit climbed into the millions of dollars, accumulated $1 and $2 and $5 at a time, by hundreds of thousands of people over 9 years, none of whom had owned anything at all a decade earlier. The passbook was the whole thing. It was a piece of paper with a number on it that said, "You worked, you saved, and you have something." It was the receipt on the promise of freedom, and it is worth asking what they were saving for, because they were not saving abstractly. They were saving for land, 40 acres of it, if they could get it, and they had been told they would. They were saving for a mule and a plow and seed. They were saving to put a roof on a house they owned rather than a cabin somebody else owned. They were saving to send a child to one of the new bureau schools, and then, if the money held, to one of the new colleges. They were saving to bury their dead with dignity, which is why the burial societies had accounts. They were saving to find the people who had been sold away from them and to bring them home, which cost money and travel and advertisements and time. Every dollar in the Freedmen's Savings Bank had a purpose attached to it, and the purposes were the entire architecture of a life that had been legally forbidden until 1865. Beginning in 1867, black trustees started to be appointed to the board, and their numbers grew steadily through the bank's life. Men of real standing in black Washington took seats at that table, and then in 1870, Congress amended the charter. This is the hinge of the entire story, and in the record it is a small piece of legislative housekeeping. The restriction was relaxed. The bank was now permitted to invest half of its reserve in, and the exact language matters, notes and bonds secured by real estate mortgages. Real estate. In Washington, D.C., in 1870, in the middle of the largest speculative building boom the capital had ever seen, an era of vast public works and vaster private fortunes, in which a great deal of money was being made very quickly by men who were extremely good at being near it. The vault had a door in it now, but the bank had already been ignoring the vault anyway. As early as 1869, a full year before Congress relaxed anything, the Freedmen's Savings Bank had purchased bonds of the Union Pacific and Central Railroads. That was not a gray area. It was a flat violation of the charter under which the institution existed. Nobody stopped it. Nobody said anything. Nobody appears to have noticed. Congress was supposed to notice. The charter made the United States Congress the supervisor of this bank. That was the arrangement. And in the words of the Treasury Department's own history of the affair, no one had been watching what the trustees were doing. Congress was supposed to supervise the Freedmen's Bank and paid little attention. When Congress finally sent the comptroller of the currency to look carefully at the books, it was too late. Too late by years. So who was actually steering the money? The head of the bank's finance committee was a man named Henry D. Cook. Henry D. Cook was the brother of Jay Cook. It is difficult to overstate who Jay Cook was in 1870s America. Jay Cook and Company had sold the bonds that financed the Union war effort. Jay Cook, more than any other private individual, had paid for the Civil War. He was the financial power behind the Northern Pacific Railroad. In the Washington of that decade, he was not so much a banker as a climate, and his brother sat on top of the investment decisions of the Freedmen's Savings Bank. It is worth understanding what Jay Cook had actually built, because it explains why nobody questioned his brother. During the Civil War, when the Union needed money faster than the tax system could produce it, Cook invented modern American bond salesmanship. He hired thousands of agents. He advertised in newspapers. He sold war bonds in denominations small enough for a school teacher to buy one, and he sold hundreds of millions of dollars of them, and in doing so, he financed the preservation of the United States. After the war, he turned that machine toward the Northern Pacific Railroad, a line that was supposed to run from Minnesota to Puget Sound across country that had almost nobody living in it. That is the man whose brother chaired the finance committee of a bank for freed slaves. In the Washington of 1871, having a Cook on your board was not a warning sign. It was the highest possible endorsement. It was the reason a trustee could look at the arrangement and see prudence instead of a hand in the till. Here is what Henry Cook did with the deposits of 61,000 freed people. He took the bank's cash and deposited a significant share of it at the First National Bank of Washington, D.C. The First National Bank of Washington was J. Cook's office. At its height, the amount parked there was $500,000. And on that $500,000 of freedmen's money, the Cook brothers paid the Freedmen's Bank 5% interest. The Freedmen's Bank was promising its own depositors 6%. Work the arithmetic on that. Black washerwomen, farmhands, and Union veterans were, without any knowledge of it, lending $500,000 to the most powerful financier in the United States at a rate that lost money on every single dollar. The difference had to be made up out of the rest of the deposits, which meant the rest of the deposits had to be pushed into something that paid more, which meant railroad bonds and mortgages, which meant risk, which meant the entire conservative architecture of the 1865 Charter had been inverted into its opposite, and the lending went further than the Cooks. The historian Justine Hill Edwards, who wrote the definitive modern account of the bank, documents the trustees lending millions of dollars to white financiers and businessmen, money out the door from an institution created for black depositors, into the hands of white men with connections to the board. The Freedmen's Savings Bank ended up financing the Washington real estate boom, the transcontinental railroads, and the ventures of its own trustees' associates. It became, functionally, a pool of black capital available for white speculation. The expansion itself became part of the problem. 34 branches across a ruined and hostile South is an enormous operational footprint for a 9-year-old institution, and each one needed a building, a cashier, a bookkeeper, and a stock of cash. The bank grew faster than its ability to control itself, which meant that the men in Washington making the investment decisions were increasingly far away from the money and increasingly unaccountable to anyone. Blackpast's account of the failure names it directly. By 1874, massive fraud among upper management and among the board of directors had taken its toll on the bank, and the economic instability of the Panic of 1873, coupled with the bank's rapid expansion, proved disastrous. 2 failures, running at once. The board was looting it, and the institution was too big and too fast for anyone to see the looting. The freedmen's money bought railroad track. The passbooks still said savings. In September of 1873, J. Cook and Company failed. It could not sell the Northern Pacific bonds. The Northern Pacific was the problem. Cook had committed his firm to selling bonds for a railroad through empty territory, and the bonds would not move, and he kept advancing the railroad money anyway, and by September of 1873, the most powerful financial house in the country was carrying a load it could not put down. When J. Cook and Company closed its doors, the New York Stock Exchange itself shut down for days. Banks failed in chains across the country, and the United States fell into a depression that would last most of a decade. A bank whose charter required 2/3 of its money to sit in treasury bonds could have watched all of that happen from behind a wall of government paper and lost nothing. That is precisely what the wall had been built for. But the wall was gone, and had been for years, and no one had told the depositors. The firm that had financed the Union collapsed, and its collapse detonated the Panic of 1873, the worst financial crisis the country had yet experienced, the beginning of a depression that ground on for most of a decade. The man who chaired the finance committee of the Freedmen's Savings Bank was the brother of the man whose failure triggered the panic that destroyed it. The runs began almost immediately. Depositors lined up outside branches and demanded their money, and this is the part that tends to get lost in the telling. The branches paid. The Freedmen's Bank met the demands. Cashiers handed over the cash to everyone who asked, day after day, until the cash reserves of the institution were drained down to nothing. What remained on the books was real estate paper and railroad bonds, in a market where nobody on earth was buying real estate paper or railroad bonds. There is a particular cruelty in the sequence of it. The bank paid out to everyone who ran on it first, which is to say the depositors who panicked earliest and lived nearest to a branch got their money, and the ones who waited or who trusted or who lived 40 miles from Vicksburg and could not get to town got nothing. The reward for believing in the institution was to be last in line at a counter with no cash behind it. And then the white trustees resigned. They went out through the end of 1873 and into 1874, one after another, walking off the board of the institution they had spent 9 years hollowing out. What they left behind was a board increasingly composed of the black trustees who had been appointed since 1867, men like Charles B. Purvis and A.T. Augusta, both physicians, and John Mercer Langston, a lawyer who would later become the first black American elected to Congress from Virginia. Purvis was a physician who taught at Howard and who had been one of the doctors who attended Abraham Lincoln after he was shot. Augusta was a surgeon, the first black man commissioned as a medical officer in the United States Army, a man who had been physically thrown off a streetcar in Washington for trying to ride to a court where he was due to testify in uniform. Langston was a lawyer and an educator who would later become the first black American elected to Congress from Virginia. These were not figureheads. These were among the most accomplished black men in the United States, and what they had been handed by men who had walked out the door was a set of books they had not written and a hole they had not dug. They inherited a corpse, and they did not yet know it. In March of 1874, the remaining trustees did the only thing they could think of. The bank's problem, as they understood it from where they sat, was confidence. Depositors were pulling money out because they were frightened. What the institution needed was a president whose name would stop the fear. There was exactly one name in America that could do that. They elected Frederick Douglass president of the Freedmen's Savings Bank. Douglass accepted. He had been a trustee, he had a personal account in the bank, he had spent years telling black Americans to deposit their money in it, from platforms, in print, with the entire moral weight of the most trusted voice in black America behind the recommendation. He was not a bystander to this institution. He was its greatest evangelist, and he believed in it completely. He was not told the truth about its condition. That is documented, and the Treasury Department's own account says it plainly. He accepted the position, not knowing how bad the situation was. The trustees induced him to take the reins. Then he opened the books. He found an institution that was insolvent and had been insolvent for some time. He found the railroad bonds. He found the mortgage paper. He found the loans to white businessmen. He found the arrangement with the cooks. He found that the money was gone, and that it had been gone before he ever walked through the door of the beautiful marble building on Lafayette Square. And Frederick Douglass did two things. First, He put $10,000 of his own money into it, an enormous personal sum, tens of thousands by some accounts, handed over as emergency aid in an attempt to hold the thing upright. Second, he wrote the 4 words that are the entire story. He said he was married to a corpse. 6 weeks after taking the job, Douglass went to the Congress of the United States and told them to shut the bank down. He, the sitting president of the institution, urged the government to close his own bank because he had done the arithmetic and concluded that every additional day it stayed open would cost the depositors more than closing it would. The trustees resisted at first. They met on June 29, 1874, and went back and forth on whether the thing could be redeemed, and concluded that it could not. On July 2, 1874, the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company suspended operations and closed its branches. Frederick Douglass was president of the Freedmen's Bank for roughly 90 days, and he is the man whose name is on the failure. The depositors found out when they got to the door. Try to picture the morning itself. A cashier arrives at the Vicksburg branch and there are already people outside. Because word has come up the river, he does not have a speech prepared because nobody in Washington sent him one. He has a key and he has no money and no instructions. So he stands in the doorway of a building with the name of a federally chartered bank on it and tells a line of people that their savings are gone, and he cannot tell them where the savings went because he does not know, because the men who moved the money were 1,500 miles away and never told him either. Then he does it again to the next person. And the next. The line does not get shorter for a while, because people keep arriving all day, and some of them do not believe him and want to see for themselves. And there is nothing to see. That scene happened in 34 places at roughly the same time, and the overwhelming majority of the people standing in those lines had no legal recourse of any kind, no lawyer, no newspaper that would take up their case, and no vote in about half the jurisdictions where they were standing. The Freedmen Savings Bank did not fail quietly. It failed on a specific Thursday in public in front of the people it had been built for. 61,144 of them. $2,993,790.68, and a widespread, incorrect, entirely reasonable belief that the United States government stood behind every cent of it. It did not. Congress had chartered the bank, had been named its supervisor, had relaxed its charter in 1870, had failed to look at its books for nearly a decade, and had guaranteed nothing. Congress appointed commissioners to liquidate the assets. Over the following decades, some depositors received partial payments, installments, a fraction on the dollar, arriving years apart, and only to those who could prove a claim. Proving a claim required the passbook, or the records, or an address the commissioners could find. A great many people could not produce any of it because they could not read, or had moved, or had died, or had lost the book, or had trusted a bank that had misplaced its own paperwork. Plenty of depositors received nothing at all. There were claims still outstanding in the 20th century, filed by the grandchildren of the account holders. The claims process deserves a moment of its own because it is where the arithmetic of the failure turned into the arithmetic of ordinary life. To recover anything, a depositor had to file. To file, a depositor had to know the bank had closed, which required news to travel to a farm in Alabama. Then the depositor had to prove the deposit, which required the passbook, and the passbook was a small paper object that had spent years in a cabin with a leaking roof, or in a coat that had been sold, or in a house that had burned. Then the depositor had to be findable when the commissioners eventually issued a payment, which required a fixed address in a population that was moving constantly in search of work. Then the depositor had to still be alive, which, given that the payments dribbled out over decades, an enormous number of them were not. Every step of that process filtered out exactly the people the bank had been created for. The system did not have to refuse them, it only had to be slow. Bills were introduced in Congress to make the depositors whole. They failed. What that money actually was is the thing to understand. It was the entire accumulated savings of Black America, 9 years of it. The first capital ever assembled by a people 3 years out of legal bondage, gathered $1 at a time by hundreds of thousands of hands, and it was supposed to be the seed of everything that came next. Land, businesses, schools, churches, the material foundation underneath emancipation. It went into railroad bonds, Washington real estate, loans to white financiers, and an account at Jay Cook's bank paying 5%. The lesson the depositors took away is the part that outlived the money. Black Americans came out of 1874 having learned, in the most expensive way available to them, that an institution with the government's name attached could take their savings, lose them, and face no consequence at all. That belief did not evaporate in 1875 or 1900 or 1950. It is one of the reasons Black Americans banked with each other, or with a mattress, for generations afterward. The Freedmen's Bank did not simply destroy $3 million. It destroyed the willingness to try again, and that cost is not calculable. Douglass carried it for the rest of his life. He wrote years later that his connection to the Freedmen's Savings Bank had brought upon his head an amount of abuse and detraction greater than any encountered in any other part of his life. Consider that sentence. This was a man who had escaped slavery, who had been beaten nearly to death in Indiana, who had been mobbed, who had been driven out of the country once for his own safety, and who had spent 40 years being publicly hated by a substantial fraction of the United States. 90 days as the president of a bank, he did not break cost him more grief than any of it. There is a version of this story in which it is simply a tragedy, a good idea, an unlucky decade, a panic nobody could have foreseen. That version has been told many times, and it is not entirely false. The panic of 1873 was real, and it destroyed institutions far larger and better run than this one. But the railroad bonds were bought in 1869, before the charter was amended and 4 years before the panic. The $500,000 went into Jay Cook's own bank at a rate that lost money on every dollar, while the finance committee was chaired by Jay Cook's brother. Millions went out in loans to white businessmen with connections to the board, and Congress, the statutory supervisor, did not open the books for the better part of 9 years.